Good day, Thomas Jefferson Hour podcast listeners. We extended last week's show, the project of reporting in and handing over the airwaves to our many listeners who were good enough to write us with reports from their part of the country, and a number of folks who called in. We started the show with Joe Ellis, and I enjoy talking to him so much and hearing from him so much. And we talked about how he, at one point in one of our conversations, he thought that it was going to take a national tragedy of some sort or crises of some sort to kind of make us reset, think things over, and come together again. And I believe he's holding to that prediction.
You know, I just want to make the case for the humanities and for the liberal arts. In the old world, before all of this came to pass, people who lived in oral and primitive cultures would see a lunar eclipse or a solar eclipse, and they would throw themselves on the ground and pray for deliverance and assume that the gods were punishing humankind and that it was the end of the world. Well, along come people like Copernicus and Galileo and Kepler, and they discover that there is an orderly system in the universe and that an eclipse is not God's visitation at all. It's a phenomenon that occasionally happens when one orb gets in the way of another. And it used to be that when plagues and diseases of this sort would spread, that people would throw themselves down and pray that God would forgive us for our mighty sinfulness and so on. Knowledge is power. Jefferson's favorite philosopher, Francis Bacon, the contemporary of Queen Elizabeth and Shakespeare, said, knowledge is power. When we know things, we can contextualize them, and it allows us to place things in a broader historical, philosophical, and theological context, and it calms us down. It gives us a reassurance that we will get through this and that things are not as zany, crazy, irrational, and sudden as they might seem. And you certainly hear that in the voice of someone like Joseph Ellis, who's written 13 books on the founding generation, who knows that generation as well as any human being alive, maybe as well as anyone has ever known the founders: Hamilton, Jefferson, Adams, Washington, Franklin, Thomas Paine, etc., Abigail Adams, Mercy Otis Warren. He is able to place what's going on now in this deep matrix that he's developed over the course of his life of understanding the course of history. And people who have a background in science, if Carl Sagan were alive, he'd be on every talk show and he'd be reassuring us about what we know and what it is possible for human ingenuity to do about a situation like this. We need this, and we've been starving ourselves in America in the liberal arts and in the humanities. It's a crisis, and that's why having Joe Ellis on this program is so important, because every time he's on, he widens and deepens the contexts in which we think about slavery and masculinity and gender questions and the American Revolution vis-a-vis, say, the French Revolution and so on. And then there's David Nicandri, who's our Enlightenment guy. Whenever you need to hear what the Enlightenment would say, you just need to call up Nicandri, and in his usual jovial and genial way, he provides essential insights into this. And what has struck me over the last 2 weeks as we've gone through these comments from around the country is, I know it's going to sound self-serving. I don't mean it to be. It's how effective the Jefferson Hour has been, because so many people have said, this is a Jeffersonian moment. This could be a restoration of Jeffersonian self-reliance and agrarianism and a better understanding of where we fit in nature, and a sense that human optimism is one of the most important tools we have. Caller after caller has, without being prompted, has said, this is a possible Jeffersonian revival moment for America. And that just gives me, David, such complete joy and satisfaction, because I think they're right. The Enlightenment was right. The scientific revolution was right. The liberal arts are right. And we can't continue to starve those things in this country. We can't be an anti-intellectual country that just wants to entertain itself if we want to be able to stay serene in the face of these extraordinary disruptive events that are occurring in the world.
We hope these past 2 weeks have provided a little bit of insight, comfort, thoughtfulness for our listeners. There's sort of a billboard for those of you who listen to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. If you have any ideas of constructive things we can do during this national crisis, please let us know.
And send in I asked in the last week's program for people to send in their reading list. What are you reading? The books that you've always wanted to read and haven't, ever really taken the time. Send us that. Tell us what the hobbies you're taking up or what things you're doing that you've been waiting for a sabbatical to do, and now the world has given you this sabbatical. In addition to that, I'm creating online courses, and so one of them will be on pandemics. That one will be launched in early April, so watch for that on the Jefferson Hour site. And also I'm going to do a much more ambitious online course on what is the Enlightenment and why does it matter and why does it still matter. I can't wait for both of these. There will be a cost, but it's a relatively modest one. And so let's find a way to overcome our physical separation by creating a virtual community or a set of communities in which we can use this moment to deepen our lives and step back and look in the mirror and decide who we want to be and how we can take this crisis as opportunity to reboot in all sorts of interesting ways. And all of the cultural tours are still on, and anyone worried about the Lewis and Clark tour this summer, don't. If you have to, you can drive to Great Falls, Montana. You'll probably be able to fly, but that program is not going to be canceled, and we will be in the safest place in the world when we're canoeing on the Missouri and hiking up on the Wendover Death March. So life goes on, and we will improve it because innovations are coming that nobody could have anticipated on the other side of this global pandemic.
There's one letter we didn't get to this week. Do you mind if I stick that into the intro here? It came from, I think you have it too, Karen Kassir.
Right.
From Palm Springs, California, Coachella Valley. And she says her husband works for county mental health. He's reporting to work but isolating in his office. She stayed home as much as possible with her four-legged kids. Like Clay, I have tons of books waiting to be read. Grocery stores are allowing seniors special early entry in the mornings, although store shelves are still quite empty in many areas. She gives this line, quote, "I'll trade you 2 toilet rolls for a carton of eggs." She says they're very thankful for state and county government officials who stepped up immediately. And people realize now there is an important place for government and planning ahead.
Well, that's an important point.
Yep.
Now more than ever, we need government to be a rational, soothing, masterful, coordinating entity, state, local, and national, so that we can look at this with one national consensus and that we can assure ourselves that we will get on top of this.
See, and that you got it exactly why I was sorry I missed that letter, because that's such an important point. It's so easy for us to just dismiss government as a bad thing, and they don't know what we need government in a time like this.
This is also a time for us to realize that a great deal of the vaccination debate of the past 15 years has been baloney. We need vaccines. That's why smallpox was finally put in a petri dish, why polio is almost completely eliminated from the world, and this virus too will be solved by vaccines.
As long as you're going to admonish, you can dish it out, but can you take it? Robert Longrear. Secondly, I think Clay was misguided in saying he felt safe after shaking over 85 hands prior to eating because he had an antiseptic cleansing cloth under his table. What about the ability to pass the virus to those with whom he shook hands? Well, things have changed a lot.
Well, I wrote to him. I think you saw my reply. I said, "You're right," and I never would have even said that a week later. But keep in mind that I don't even like it in healthy times. You shake 80 hands and then you have to eat your rubber chicken at a banquet. I feel like a petri dish whenever I do that. So I always carry wet ones and other disinfecting
you
wipes.
You are an extremely responsible adult, I think. I think.
What's your hesitation here? We're in studio, but we are separated by double panes of glass.
Yeah, and we're being extremely cautious.
The cultural tours are on. The program continues now more than ever. I think the Jefferson Hour is important, and we we need support.
Should one of us get exposed or become ill, we've already made plans on how we can work remotely, and we may do that. There's talk about doing 3 or 4 episodes on your new book, and I'm really hoping we do that. Yeah.
We're going to do that during this interim. I'm reading War and Peace. I can't wait to hear what our listeners are reading. I'm reading the Brothers Karamazov, so I've set myself some whoppers here. I thought Dickens was long-winded.
With that, let's go to the show, and thanks again, everyone, for listening, and please go to jeffersonhour.com if you can and support the show, but at least keep in touch with us. Tell us what you'd like next.
This, too, will pass.
Hello, my name is Joseph Ellis. I'm an American historian. I live in Amherst, Massachusetts, but I'm speaking from a second home up in the Green Mountains of Vermont, top of a mountain that just had 5 inches of snow. The quarantine, to me, is actually, I have 2 reactions. One, obviously, I'm worried about how much food I'm going to be able to store here, but my wife and I will manage. And it's throwing me back to certain austerities and certain simplicities that are, to me, I have a nostalgic fondness for. So while it's horrible, and I don't bless it by any stretch, but it's helping me get away from the telephone, from contact with too many conversations that are unnecessary. And because I'm a writer and I've got my stuff here, I can do my work in a way I don't depend on anybody else. In brief, this is a difficult time. And we as Americans need to come together as a collective, as we haven't for quite some time. This might do it. And there's a Jeffersonian dimension to this. Everybody is self-governed, but they're self-governed within a collective. And we have to be careful that we're not going to infect anybody else, and as well as take care of ourselves. Anyway, I'm not enjoying this, but I'm discovering certain silver linings in this dark cloud. Do take care.
Welcome to this special edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. I'm Clay Jenkinson, out of character this time. It feels a little frivolous almost to put on a wig and tights at a moment like this in American history, but I am mighty glad that my life is so touched by the achievements of the 3rd President of the United States, the sage of Monticello, Thomas Jefferson. That was Dr. Joseph Ellis, who is one of our favorite people on the Thomas Jefferson Hour, one of our correspondents, the author of a range of excellent books about the founding generation, including a couple that are my favorite, Passionate Sage, about the character and life of John Adams, and American Sphinx, his book about the enigmatic character of Thomas Jefferson. He's an extraordinary man, and I thought that was a brilliant and extremely measured response, David.
And personal as well. But yeah, I remember a previous conversation with Joe, and he talked about how divided we are as a society now, and I can't remember his exact words, but somehow he said it's going to take some major world event to change that, and he's sticking to it and thinks maybe this might be part of that.
It could be. It was Franklin who said during the time of the early revolution, we need to hang together or we will assuredly hang separately.
Right.
And I think there's something to that we realize that we need each other. We need to avoid hoarding. We need to help those who are in particular need. We need to be more tolerant than we normally are. There's so much criticism of the Trump administration over this, and I feel a lot of it myself, but I also feel these are these things that happen once in 100 years, 300 years, 500 years. We're talking about something that's unprecedented. Nobody could have predicted 6 weeks ago that 1 out of every 4 Americans would be essentially in seclusion. Nobody could have predicted that the NBA season would be abandoned, or that the Final Four NCAA tournament would be completely jettisoned, or that the Olympics in Japan would probably be postponed or maybe canceled. Nobody could have predicted any of these things. This is beyond the capacity of any government to anticipate it. You can go through all of the the tabletop scenarios and exercises that you want. But when this comes, it comes from every direction all at once, and you scramble. I don't think this administration has scrambled very well, but I don't think that any presidential administration could have been ready, no matter how much they anticipated something like this, ready for how many moving parts there are to this crisis and how difficult it is for any entity at any level, state, local, or national, or even in a household, fully to come to terms with this. And so I think we need to unify here, and we need to realize that a lot of very well-meaning people in the national arena and in the state and local arenas are working day and night to try to get us through this with the least death, the least disruption, and the least chaos. And I have great respect for that, and I urge everyone who's listening to try to forbear, even when you can hardly help it, striking out in anger or frustration, because we will get through this together. I can't imagine that anyone would want to be the president of the United States or the governor of a state at this moment.
Here's a report from one of our favorite listeners, Russ Eagle from North Carolina.
Hi, this is Russ Eagle. I'm a regular Jefferson Hour listener, podcast listener, living in Salisbury, North Carolina. In the last hour, today is March 19th. We just in the last hour had our first confirmed case in the county where I live. My wife and I are fortunate that we are retired. So other than canceling a little travel, this hasn't really affected our lifestyle that much. I do have two parents living an hour away in their 80s, and so I'm having to run their errands and grocery shopping and that sort of thing. I guess one thing that's happening here that seems to be happening everywhere for whatever reason, there is no toilet paper to be found in the entire county, and we are the home of the largest grocery store chain in the South, Food Lions. Just the corporate office is just maybe 2 miles from my house. So, we should be better than most. Our stores are pretty well stocked now, except for those paper products. As for me, like I said, we're pretty fortunate. Here in the South, it's 75 degrees today, and we're starting our gardens and just trying to do things around the house. The public reaction around here has been, I think, in line with what's going on nationally. There has not been any real pushback from the community. The schools have closed, the restaurants have closed. Everybody seems to be taking it in stride. The school buses are out delivering meals. And I think, given today's political climate, I think the community is probably pulling together better right now than they have on anything in recent years. So, if you want to look for a silver lining, you never know how long that's going to last. But I think the community response has been positive, no unusual or negative reactions. People are pulling together to help neighbors, people that can't go out or shouldn't go out, and that sort of thing. So overall, I think the public response around here has been very positive. One of the great things about the Jefferson Hour is the great backlog, just decades of shows. So, this is a great time, in my opinion, to go back and listen to some of those old shows.
What's worse than the pandemic, listening to old Jefferson Hours? That's Russ Eagle, one of my favorite people in the world. He was my cohort on the great Mount Whitney expedition. He's going to be okay, and I'll tell you why. First of all, remember the Robinson Crusoe pea project? Right. So he probably has a warehouse full of peas now.
Well, he's already out planting his garden for this year, so that's good.
I remember when I went to the Mariana Islands out near Guam, and if you can imagine it, they have a Mariana Humanities Council, part of the National Endowment for the Humanities. Feels a little far-fetched, but they do. I went there to give some talks, I think 15 years ago, and I asked my host, who was the director of the Mariana Islands Humanities Committee, I said, "How do you like living here at the edge of the known world?" And he said, "Before or after Amazon.com." So as long as Russ has Amazon Prime, he's happy. A few peas, maybe a glass of wine now and then. And Amazon Prime, he orders more books than I do. He makes me look like a modest purchaser of books.
I have trouble believing that.
Yes.
But he said, again, that this is a crisis that may pull people together.
I think there's a lot of hope. We'll see.
Not everybody looks at it with quite that much of a lunar view. I have just a short call from an 11-year-old who's a fifth grader.
Let's hear that.
My name is Phoebe, and I'm 11 years old and in the fifth grade. I think that the coronavirus has affected me because, we don't have school anymore, and that's sort of cool because you don't have school, but also sort of weird because it's I don't get to see my friends, and I can't really go to my grandparents' house or anything because of the coronavirus. I read this article and it said that when kids get it, it's not very strong or anything, and that kids my age would probably be fine. So I'm a little worried, but not that worried because we'll probably be fine, but we don't know what's happening. So it's kind of weird not to know, but it's probably going to be fine because we can still do school from home and then get exercise, walking around outside. And so I don't think it's going to be too bad, but it'll be a little interesting.
Lovely Phoebe. You could hear the same subject that my daughter, who's 25 years old, said in last week's program, which is, It's probably going to be okay. It's disruptive, not too sure, a little worried.
It's going to be interesting.
Probably going to be interesting. Everyone's feeling the same thing. We just don't know where this is headed and how severe that it's going to be. Is it going to be Lord of the Flies? Or is it going to be Ebola on steroids?
This is coming from a man who watched Contagion recently.
And, it really scared me because in Contagion, the social order breaks down and people begin to loot and they begin to fight each other, and people have to get weapons to protect what little they have.
Let's not give anybody ideas of things, though.
Well, gun sales have skyrocketed yet again in the United States in the face of this pandemic. What I'd like to hear, my friend, is from the great David Nicandri, our Enlightenment exemplar.
We shall hear from him in the next segment. I'd like you to read some emails that we've received as well.
I will do so, sir.
We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, this special edition on the pandemic, the coronavirus, COVID-19 pandemic of 2020. We're checking in, David, with our friends around the country and around the world. We've got some great ones, and somebody that I always want to hear from when I'm trying to wrestle with the big questions of America is David Nicandri of the state of Washington, formerly the director of the Washington State Historical Society, the author of a very highly regarded book on Lewis and Clark called River of Promise, and a new book coming out later this year on Captain James Cook's third and final voyage.
This is David Nicandri from Tumwater, Washington. This has been a little bit of ground zero with the virus out here. It's been very strange having to adjust and create new habits. There does occur to me to be another larger quasi-Jeffersonian context within which to consider our predicament. And this is perhaps dangerous ground, and I want to choose my words very carefully. And Clay could actually provide the actual verbiage from Jefferson. I'm not even sure at what point in his life he said something to this effect, that cities are the repositories of pestilence, both moral and physical. People are better off being in the land, working in the land, and being in agrarian communities. But the larger point, I think, is this. We have viewed life and development, and our moral compass has kind of taken the projection, I'll call it a linear projection. everything's kind of moving in one day. We kind of got lackadaisical about epidemics. But Jefferson, being the agrarian he was, rather than a linear, he had a circular view of man's place on earth. More organic in the sense that what you take from the soil, you return to the soil. And that everything's not additive, everything's not developmental, but the throwaway culture, the heavy emphasis on materialism, we would do very well, in my opinion, by returning to circularity as a manner of understanding our life and how we manage life in this sublunary world, to quote Meriwether Lewis, and by working in our gardens, becoming more self-sufficient, perhaps even by spreading out a little bit more, because we are really seeing the consequences, as Thomas Jefferson had foretold rather presciently over 200 years ago, the consequences of a highly commercial, highly urbanized existence. We see that, I dare say, with greater clarity in the current moment than we've had a chance to, perhaps, in over 100 years. So that's my report from the great Northwest. My best wishes to everyone out there in what I might call Jefferson Nation.
Oh, my. Oh, well, I agree with him. You know, those letters that Jefferson wrote about this came after the yellow fever epidemic in Philadelphia in 1793, and it really led him to think, you know, Jefferson's a radical, if radical means going to the root. When he was in France on the eve of the French Revolution, he had radical thoughts about national debts, perpetual constitutions, perpetual laws, the distribution of the fruits of life in a complex urbanized society. And after the yellow fever epidemic, he stepped back and said, well, since we haven't really peopled the continent yet, we're really still huddled on the eastern seaboard, and we have this vast public domain that we are going to settle in the next few centuries. Let's plan this correctly. Let's make sure we don't create pestilential cities where there's a lot of urban unrest and crime and people prey upon each other. So he then tried to design the West as a place where we would diffuse our population and avoid those concentrations. We see now that this epidemic began in China. When it got to the United States, its first epicenter was Washington State, but now it's in New York and Detroit and Chicago and the Bay Area and the Seattle area. These are the great concentrations of population in the United States, and that's where the epidemic has the best chance because it spreads from person to person. And in the city, you have a whole lot of inadvertent contact with other human beings, where, as on a farm in Rame, North Dakota, or Broken Bow, Nebraska, or Wadena, Minnesota, you have a much smaller population base and much smaller exchange of these sorts of pathogens. And so Jefferson wanted us to be a permanently rural society. And although we certainly aren't that, what Nicandri, I think, is saying is that we could all use a little social distancing in a more permanent way, and we should think more respectfully of Jefferson's agrarianism, because it wasn't just something out of Virgil and Homer. It was an actual understanding of how advanced societies work. And the other point that Nicandri makes so brilliantly is we thought we were sort of in a post-plague, post-pandemic world where nothing really is ever going to disrupt us again in any big way. And it turns out that just wasn't true.
Let's hear another one. This comes from Barb. She's an artist living in New York. She talks about her local neighborhood reactions, how empty the city is, how she's spending some of her alone time at home, and having lived through 9/11 in New York, what she expects the citizens to behave like.
Hi, my name is Barbara. I live in Brooklyn, New York. The pandemic is certainly changed life dramatically for me, for everyone around me. I live in an apartment building with 144 units. All of the residents are in groups. We're not meeting with each other, but we're texting and emailing to make sure that we're staying in touch. It's just really stressful. I did have to go out the other day, even before the shelter in place kind of directions were given. And even then, it was just pretty grim, really eerie, kind of surreal ghost town, sort of like what happened here. There are lots of storefronts shuttered, closed, signs in windows, much less traffic on the streets, and just almost no sidewalk traffic, which is incredibly unusual for the city. I'm spending a lot of time at home, reading, writing, watching probably too much television. I did pull one of my poetry books off the shelf the other day and read out loud to myself, and that made me feel really good. So I'm going to try and do a little bit of that each day. I guess one of the things that gives me hope is having also lived in New York after 9/11. In the midst of that, there was all kinds of kindness and sharing, and I know that that's ongoing now, and I expect that there will be more of it when people are a little less fearful of being in touch. New York's, a really complex place, but also not very much different than anywhere else because people are largely the same wherever we are. So hopefully we figure it out as we move through this.
Fair enough. Interesting. People are the same everywhere. That's an Enlightenment concept, that you can change the accidents of life, but the human nature is always and everywhere the same, including in one of the world's most fascinating and complex cities, New York.
And watching too much TV, but reading poetry out loud to herself made her feel better.
Here's a letter from Nathan Hepner. In episode 1382, you asked how the COVID-19 virus is affecting people around the country. I'm in Flagstaff, Arizona. The mayor has closed gyms, restaurants, and most public places. I teach at Northern Arizona University, Military Science and Army ROTC. All of our classes will be online for the rest of the semester, but at least we still have classes. I'm expecting this will continue in some form through the summer. Hopefully classes will begin normal again in the fall. Compared to the things our forebears had to deal with, I don't think too much is now being demanded of us.
And here's one from Bradley Edwards, who says, I don't have a question. I just want to say I love the show, and it has inspired me to live a more Jeffersonian life. I've read Dumas Malone's 6 volumes before, but in the midst of this pandemic, I'm undertaking a challenge. Read all 6 volumes from 2 p.m. today until 2 p.m. on November 4th. That's ambitious, is it not?
That can be done. I haven't read through Dumas Malone for many years. He is the greatest biographer of Jefferson, eminently worth reading, accurate, authoritative, definitive. The only warning that I would give to people is that he loves Thomas Jefferson and essentially thinks that Jefferson can do no wrong, which is not a widely held view anymore. Here's a letter from Sue Hush. I'm responding to your question about what's happening in our town. We live in Ridgeway, Colorado, south of Montrose and Grand Junction. We're a town of 950 in a close-knit community. Our local restaurants are doing to-go only by order of the Colorado governor. Streets are vacant. We are very worried about our local businesses and those who work in our service industry. We don't think the 2 weeks we've been told to quarantine will be enough. We're also very concerned and disgusted with the hoarding behaviors that have left many of our residents without the basics. We very much appreciate your perspective from today's program. We hope people will express empathy and concern for others and not just for themselves. Thank you also for the reading list. At least we have some time to do that now. That's Sue Hush from Ridgeway, Colorado, where I have performed.
Here's one from Priscilla Albright. She writes, the COVID-19 pandemic has brought everyone home. School and work are accessed electronically, which isn't that unusual anymore. Since I live in a rural area in northwest Missouri, I am not encountering panicking shoppers desperate to hoard supplies. Still, I worry as I hear people are beginning to predict looting. So to take my mind off the present, I am reading Nathaniel Philbrook's Mayflower, planting early spring vegetables, and baking bread for my family and leaving loaves for my friends. Good for you. That's from Priscilla Albright.
I've been sort of looking at the behavioral patterns here in North Dakota, which is one of the most law-abiding and decent places in America.
About that, but
And so I've only gone out a couple of times and only when absolutely necessary, but I've been to the grocery store a couple of times, and toilet paper doesn't last long on the shelves. I don't see hoarding. I certainly don't see people fighting over limited resources, but people are quick to pick up whatever is available in the basic needs that they have. I haven't seen any social breakdown so far, but of course, remember, we're in the very earliest stages of this. I think my daughter is a good example. She goes out every day in England, in Oxford, to look for bread, to look for beans, to look for soup, to look for milk, and so on. And when she goes to these stores, they're frequently empty. She's not particularly concerned because, A, there's enough food. She can get food. And B, she reckons that this too will pass, that the supply side will catch up with the need and that there will be plenty of food. But, of course, that could break down, David. We don't know. There may come a time when there isn't a roll of toilet paper to be had in America. We may come to a time when you can't buy spaghetti. If that happens, the social breakdown will start to accelerate. But so far, I think everyone has the sense that we kind of got caught on the back of our heels, and it's going to take a while for these small panic purchases to end and people to get a little more comfortable, and then there will be plenty in all of our stores. If that doesn't happen, that's a whole new ballgame, and it's Lord of the Flies.
Here's a phone message from Joanne in Portland. She works at a nursing school.
Hi, my name's Joanne. I live in Portland, Oregon. I work with online nursing students. All of my students are working overtime now and are exhausted. So my job right now is just to be supportive. My students are already registered nurses, and now they're working on their bachelor's degree. But they're all working nurses, most with families or single moms. And I've gotten a lot of emails about how hard they're working and how they don't have enough supplies. I know the School of Nursing just sent a large shipment of extra supplies that the school had of masks and gloves and so on to one of the women's clinics in town that was out of supplies. Our faculty have been amazing in granting them all extensions on their work. And I think we're all being super supportive of the students and of the faculty. I was doing okay with this whole pandemic business until I was on my way home from work the other night, and I stopped at 2 different gas stations, and they were both closed. And since I had less than a quarter of a tank, I got a little panicky. So I went into the grocery store at one of the stations, and there was no toilet paper, no Kleenex, no paper towels. So instead, I bought fruit and cookies. And when I got up to check out, the gal said, "Fruit and cookies, huh?" And I said, "It's pandemic supplies." And she said, "Are you sure you don't want to go back and get a bottle of wine to go with those?" I didn't.
Again, that mix of cheerfulness, resoluteness, and anxiety. I think we're hearing that from everyone. But, we did get one call from a college student who wanted to shed some deep skepticism on this whole phenomenon. Do you have that one handy?
I'm a sophomore at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I don't really believe that the steps to prevent the spread of this virus were best explained or maybe taken a little bit too hastily due to canceling literally everything from flights to colleges to a lot of jobs in the service industry, like restaurants and bars, closing and having to lay off people. To close everything and freak out wasn't the correct decision, since now we're in a recession. It's going to take a lot of work to come back, and kids are missing graduation, which is an important moment in life. But then on the flip side of the coin, you still have people traveling, which is interesting that you'd close down everything but still let kids go to Florida for spring break. So I think instead of freaking out and closing, we should have just been smarter and say, okay, self-quarantine if you want to, if you need to, but this virus is coming. And instead of tanking the economy and putting everyone into this apocalyptic mode, we could have just let things continue as they were.
Fair enough. I think these are important questions. I don't think it's necessarily wrong-headed of this young man to respond to this as he has. I mean, one of two things is going to prove to have been true, David. Either this is a very virulent flu-like thing that's going to pass as flus pass, and it's going to be much less cataclysmic than has been suggested, and we're going to wonder why this touched the panic button in quite the way that it did. I think that's what he's saying. Or we're going to discover that, if anything, the predictions underplayed what was likely to come, and that we did not enough and not in time, and that we actually need to be much more draconian and to really lock down civilization, unless we just want to let this wave pass through and kill those that's going to kill and so on. I think we don't know yet enough about what this is. My hope is that it proves to be less virulent and less universal than the worst case projections. But my guess is that this is going to be much bigger than the annual flu problems that the world faces. I do worry about the proms and the high school graduations and the baccalaureates and the rodeo and the family reunions and the church picnics and the Olympics and all the things. These things are deep disappointments, but I think that it's better to be safe than sorry on a question of this sort.
We're going to take a short break. When we come back, we have two more calls, one from Rick Kennerly and one from Beau Wright. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
My name is Beau Wright, and I live in Lynchburg, Virginia. And the community sort of battened down the hatches over the past couple weeks. A lot of our restaurants have closed their doors or are moving to sort of takeout service. Our hospital is sort of gearing up to accept new patients with the virus. But I think one of the really wonderful things, as I've sort of been moving around town, obviously maintaining social distance, is just seeing how many people are out and about, again, not interacting with each other, but enjoying the weather, taking time to be with family and to check in on their friends, doing so responsibly. We've seen here on social media, especially, just a real outpouring of care for our neighbors and for our community. A lot of fundraisers have been started to support our local food bank. And, for folks to have been in their own kitchens preparing food, again, responsibly, to share with others. So it's been a really, I think, an incredible testament to what community means here in our city of 80,000, to see everybody really pull together and support each other, regardless of the politics of the day. So it's been really heartening, and, it really lifted our spirits in what has otherwise been a really challenging time. My hope is that states and localities taking pretty stringent measures that we'll be able to at least flatten the curve. I'm hopeful, but I'm sure that the worst is still to come.
Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. I'm Clay Jenkinson, sitting here with David Swensen, and that was our friend Beau Wright of Lynchburg in Virginia. He's a city councilman there. He's one of our frequent contributors to the Jefferson Hour, and he got through all of that without mentioning the word Barack Obama.
You made me laugh.
Well, it's true, because you know that if we had teed him up and said, give us a little report card, but we didn't do it.
We should tell people that he was in Obama's administration.
He was in, and he's on, when he appears on this program, he doesn't pull his punches on the difference between this administration and the last one. Here's a thought, David, from my own neighborhood. I live in a subdivision in the north end of Bismarck, North Dakota. In the last week, I've seen more people out walking than I've seen in years. I think people are stir crazy.
That's true. Me too.
And they're
I agree
walking
with
their
that.
neighborhoods.
Yeah,
and I think that's good.
Yeah, it is.
That is good for them. That's good for this country. It's
and
good for
a lot
family.
of reading going on, too.
A lot of binge watching and a lot of reading. And so they're both important
Didn't you
escapes.
say something about trying to make it through the entire catalog of NCIS, which I don't even know what it is?
Yeah, people are doing that. And my daughter keeps saying to me, Dad, Homeland. You've got to watch Homeland.
Oh, really? Okay.
And so last night I watched episode 1, but I can't afford to buy the rest. I'm not a highly subsidized Oxford student like my child. Mm-hmm. Here's a letter on a more sort of mundane front, but an important one from Cheryl Leonhardt. She said, you ask how different communities are reacting. I live in Colorado Springs. I hope you'll share this idea with your listeners. If you are without toilet paper and other paper products, don't despair. Take an old sheet or two, old clothes, bandanas or scarves, towels, tablecloths, wash rags, or just plain rags, and cut them into squares to use as toilet paper. Experiment with the size. Too big is better than too small, indeed. Mine are 7 inches by 7 inches, or like a tissue if the cloth is thick. I keep my used cloths under the sink in a small bucket and simply wash them with my normal laundry. I have tried both soaking them and not soaking them before washing and found that soaking was not necessary. Others may want their clothes cleaner than I do and can wash them separately in hot water with bleach. I was lucky to find old flannel sheets to create my toilet paper from. It's soft and comfortable, and no trees have been destroyed for my derriere.
And then goodness, we're at the bottom now, right?
Now that's the history of toilet paper from the bottom up, let's say.
But don't flush.
Yeah, don't flush. Do not flush.
We have one more comment that I want to make sure we get in from Rick Kennerly.
Our old friend from Virginia.
Yeah, he's been on the show a number of times, and always an interesting fellow. It was great to talk to him.
My name is Rick Kennerly. I'm in Virginia Beach. The response of the Virginia Beach area is to take it in stride. There are worries about the local economy, but we can do much to protect ourselves, to make ourselves better. This could be the beginning of a very Jeffersonian kind of revival in public life and in private lives. A little more community focused, a lot more individually focused, developing the kinds of Jeffersonian skills and traits that would support each of us and help us support our neighbors. And so, if nothing else, this is probably a way to accelerate the intergenerational transfer of wealth. I have been somewhat critical of my generation, Clay's generation, your generation, the baby boomers. And I think we have been an extremely selfish and short-sighted generation. And so I'd like to see us point ourselves a little more in the direction of what can we do to make the next generation a better generation. I can remember as a young man, I'm 67 now, so as a young child actually, going to Overton Elementary School in Lubbock, Texas on a bright, sunny Sunday in May, and standing in line in my little suit and tie with my family and all these other families to get that little magic sugar cube that prevented polio. And you had to go 2 Sundays in a row, I think it was. And I remember the absolute terror in my childhood during the summer of polio and outbreaks of polio. And children that were in my class that I remember one guy named Bruce disappeared for half a year and came back with a brace. And a girl named Lisa disappeared and was in an iron lung forever. So we have dealt with long-term crippling kinds of disease and outbreaks before in the past, but we've been complacent in the last few decades. And I think this will help us get back on track, perhaps.
Interesting commentary from our friend Rick Kennerly. You know, David, my mother had a mild case of polio.
I did not know that.
And of course, one of the greatest presidents in American history, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, had a major, serious case of polio. And it deepened his soul and probably helped to save this country in another one of its great critical moments, the combination of the Great Depression and the coming of World War II. So valuable insight from Rick Kennerly. And I remember as a child, I think probably you do too, having those 2 sugar cubes in 2 successive weeks to take the polio vaccine when it was still new.
There's a couple more letters I'd like to get in before we run out of time. One I would really like you to read is from Judith Workman. And there's also one from Larry McInnes, which I'll just sort of paraphrase. He's from Beaver, Utah, population 300, talks about how the community there is impacted, restaurants closed, and his girlfriend's a chef. The most notable description has been at our only small grocery store. But he says, a good friend used to say, "This too shall pass." I hope it happens sooner rather than later, and I'm comforted by the fact that I chose to retire in such a small, secluded town in the mountain time zone. As Jefferson would say, I'd have written less if I'd have had more time.
That was actually Mark Twain, but
I
still.
thought so, yeah.
Good. This is a letter
Thanks,
from...
Larry.
Yeah, very nice. Thank you very much for that report. David, this is a letter from Judith Workman. I remember her well. She says, I've been listening to the Jefferson Hour since 2008 and was lucky enough to participate in the Lewis and Clark Cultural Tour of 2017. That was my top bucket list item at the time and was thrilled to be able to compete in the Wendover Death March. I usually listen to the podcast while on a walk around the vineyard during my lunch hour at the winery where I work. Clay, if you are now saying send wine, I did in August of 2017. I sent one library Cabernet and a library Chardonnay. And thank you so much for those. Keep sending them, Judith. That was wonderful. Moving on. I live in Northern California, and in response to your request
That's not exactly what she wrote. But
I live in Northern California. Here's a report. I'm in the over 65 demographic. So as soon as the governor of California requested all people 65 and over sequester themselves, I did. Now most of the counties in this area have instituted a shelter-in-place order. I do not feel that we are panicking, but we are taking it very seriously. The winery where I work in Upper Napa Valley closed the tasting room to the public, but it started offering drive-by pickup service, reducing shipping. Free is illegal, and virtual tastings. I am, of course, staying home. At home on my impromptu vacation, I'm getting to all those house and garden projects that I was always trying to get to, reading and, of course, listening to all of my podcasts. Since I started listening to the Jefferson Hour, I've added at least a dozen others that I listen to on a regular basis. It sounds like in the wide open spaces of North Dakota, this all must seem very surreal, but it is a matter of population density, I think. I feel that we have an advantage over the people of San Francisco and San Jose because the population here is much less dense where I live, but I imagine that you are even more removed at the barn. Shut the barn door before the horse gets out, and you should be fine.
It's time for this week's essay, Clay, but before we go there, I want to thank all of the people who contributed to this and last week's show. It's great to hear from you. Keep them coming, and we'll keep reading them and keep doing the show as long as we can. But now, sir, it is time for this week's Jefferson Watch.
Hello, my friends. Here's the basis of my optimism. First, in Jefferson's time, the best physicians and scientists didn't know where plagues come from. They knew diseases were communicable, but they did not really understand infection. We do understand epidemiology. Second, in Jefferson's time, there were no vaccines except for smallpox, discovered relatively late in Jefferson's life, and back then millions of people rejected the very idea of vaccination. Today we know the alchemy of vaccines, and my guess is that we will have one much sooner than we think. Third, the digital revolution has changed absolutely everything. It enables people to work from home, to know what is happening all over the planet, and to check in with their distant friends and loved ones. My daughter Catherine and I FaceTime every day, sometimes a couple of times per day, from distant corners of the planet. This relieves most of the fear of uncertainty. The digital revolution, literally billions of computers linked by the internet, means that we can chart the disease and the methods by which both science and the social structure cope with the disease in ways that would have been unthinkable in the time of Thomas Jefferson. All that connectivity represents a kind of global data sorting engine, a kind of global computer, in which every laptop and every home computer plays an important part, for good or for ill. Knowledge is power. Just imagine how different the world would be if we had no television and no internet right now. The world would probably just collapse. Finally, we know hygiene. We know how to protect ourselves by washing our hands with disinfecting soap. In the age of Jefferson, hygiene had not yet been understood. Even through the Civil War in America, doctors handled patients, including wounds and surgery, without washing their hands. America is now the land of detergents. In my view, this is going to be over sooner than we think. The plague is going to sweep away whole habits, whole institutions and systems, just as the 2008 economic meltdown swept away whole parts of the American economy. The pandemic is going to force an end to some of the absurd paralysis in our national government. If the partisan bickering does not end, the people will rise up and throw all the rascals out, because we need government now, and we have no time for the silly and dangerous game both sides have been playing for many, many years. Brave new waves of creativity are going to emerge as if out of nowhere, and new enterprises, new institutions, new coalitions, new art forms, new leaders are going to grow out of the ashes of the world of 2020, just as spectacular new forests were born after the cataclysmic Yellowstone fire of 1988. We're going to have to reinvent ourselves to a certain extent. That sounds like bad news, but it is actually extremely good news, because we needed to reinvent ourselves. Now that I have had a couple of weeks of fear and loathing and self-pity and anxiety and pure uncertainty to look into the mirror of my life, I see so much that I want to address. I won't bore you with all the details, but I'm rethinking everything. On the brink of this cataclysm, the American people were a toxic bunch, most of us, living as if this gravy train of consumption, vulgarity, materialism, and narcissism would never end. Anyone who stopped to think about it knew that we were on an unsustainable trajectory for ourselves, our relationships, our country, and even the planet. You may or may not accept the Gaia principle, that the Earth is a living organism with a world soul, and that Gaia is giving us a wake-up call here. Even if that is just fanciful, we need to look on the coronavirus pandemic as a wake-up call for ourselves and our civilization. You know the Bellamy Brothers song, "Jesus is coming back, and boy is he pissed." I think that that's how we need to think about this. This pandemic gives us all the best chance we have ever had to learn, as Thoreau put it, to live deliberately. We must not duck this opportunity. I have always sneered a little at the cliché that the Chinese character for crisis is also the character for opportunity. That, plus the Chinese curse, "May you live in interesting times," is more or less what we think we know about Chinese wisdom. But both may be true. The epidemic rose in China. The metaphysical answer may come from China too. I know that once I got over the original annoyance I felt, and even the odd exhilaration of scouring the grocery stores in search of beans, rice, flour, and toilet paper, so far it has been like a plague, at least for me, I began to ask myself what good can come out of the COVID-19 virus for me, for my family, and for our shared culture. I urge each of you to look upon this crisis as opportunity and to ask yourself how you can use the pandemic as an excuse or a catalyst to reboot your life. I am blessed in so many ways. I have great friends around the country and around the world, some of you listening at this moment. I get to read for a living. I get to try to embody one of the most interesting men who ever lived on earth, certainly one of the most gifted, the man who laid down the planks of the American dream. Jefferson has something interesting to say about every topic a free man or woman must come to terms with. I get to travel the country and the world, or at least I did. I have a library that is large enough that I can coast out, even if I never order another book, even if I never leave the house again. And now that I'm sorting my books and reorganizing my library, I'm finding volumes I never even knew I had and now very much want to read. Above all, I have the daughter of daughters. My love of my daughter Catherine is boundless, and it is without question the great love of my life. She is my everything, and I have you. You know who you are, lifting the enlightenment in America and working now and always to find and inhabit your best selves. My friends, we will get through this. Humanity's capacity to regroup, recover, and bounce back is perhaps our greatest evolutionary advantage. Thanks to the Renaissance and the scientific revolution, we have a breathtaking array of tools with which to climb on top of this crisis. We do not need to cringe and wring our hands and pray for divine intervention here. That intervention is happening in labs all across the planet. We need to turn science loose with a blank check to solve this and most of the other problems that we all face. And we need to reinvigorate the humanities, too, so that we have a better historical, philosophical, theological, artistic, and literary context in which to make sense of this and all of the other bewilderments that have taken over our once overconfident civilization. Let's get started. This could be the moment that sparks a second renaissance and a new American Enlightenment. I'm Clay Jenkinson. We'll see you next week for another important edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any show for a $12 donation, please call 701-575-0727. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.com and on Apple Podcasts. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.com. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Bach Cello Suite No. 3 in C Major by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program through the eyes of Thomas Jefferson.